Hello everybody and welcome back to the second shelf. This video is the first of a batch because at Christmas I made a Christmas special, so-called, because it was my video number 100 and I wanted to celebrate that. And I asked you for questions and you asked a lot. So this will be the first batch. I put all of the questions concerning reading together. And I thank you very much for asking that many wonderful questions. But without further ado, let's just start with the answers. And I have the questions here on my phone, so I will just read them to you before answering. D. Williams asks, which books did you enjoy as a child and spend many hours reading? This question assumes that I was an avid reader as a child, and the assumption is correct. I loved reading from the moment I could read. And one of the many books that I really enjoyed and reread hundreds and hundreds of times were Enid Blyton's books, and especially the series about the twin sisters Honey and Nanny. I just loved those books. And you have to know that for the German public, for the German children's public, they not only translated those books, but they transported everything into Germany. So Honey and Nanny went to a German boarding school called Linderhof, and they had, there was a German surrounding. So it was not that I read about English girls, I read about German girls. And at that time, obviously, I didn't think that the author was English, or I didn't think about it that the author was English and that it was strange that Enid Blyton would write about two twin girls living in Germany going to a German boarding school. If you're a child, I don't know, maybe you thought about these things earlier. I didn't, and I just love those books to pieces. Jennifer from Insert Literary Pun, that's her booktube channel, and if you're not subscribed, you should be, because it's a fantastic channel. So Jennifer asked, I'd be interested to hear you talk about the literary cultures across the different languages you read and the countries you're familiar with. I imagine you have a different perspective from many of the US and UK booktubers, even though you read a lot of American and British literature. Well, thank you, Jennifer. That's a great question and not an easy one to answer. But the first big difference that comes to mind, and please bear in mind, take it all with a grain of salt, because I'm generalizing here. And if you generalize, you always lose details and nuances. But generally speaking, I would say a big difference between UK-US readers and German and Dutch readers is that they are exposed to translated English fiction all the time. You could have, my first answer was already children's books, Enid Blyton. I think I was certainly not the only child reading Enid Blyton. On the contrary, those were really very popular children's books in Germany. And not only children's books, but also later, when you are an avid reader in Germany or in Holland, you are exposed to English fiction, and I mean UK and US fiction, all the time. Classics, if you read a lot, you will have read Jane Austen in the translation if you can't read English well, but also modern literature. If there is a new novel coming out by Meg Wolitzer, the novel will be translated really quickly into German and Dutch, and people will read it. And I don't think the US and the UK market translate that many books, especially, German fiction or Dutch fiction. They are translated if they are really popular and best-selling, but not on the scale that you find English language books translated into German and Dutch. So I think that's a big difference. A difference between, maybe I should have said, if you don't know me that well, I read German, Dutch, and English because I'm born in Germany and I've lived in Holland for a long time. that's just an aside. I should have said that right in the beginning. Anyway, a difference I see between Germany and Holland is that Germany is very proud of its literary heritage and of its writers. I know writers coming, for instance, from Holland to Germany and giving a reading. They are always telling me afterwards how, how not only incredibly polite the public is, but how interested and how they are, adored and admired. And I think that's a difference in culture between Holland and Germany. Holland is much more down to earth. It's a very, we are traders by nature, and literature is not something that is a big part of the public culture. In Germany, the public intellectual, the writer, is much more common than it would be in Holland. So I think that's a difference between those two countries. As for topics, I don't think you can generalize here, but maybe you could say that German literature has certain topics that will always come back in fiction, and one of those topics is how we deal with our dark past during the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. So you will have always books, even now, coming out, novels dealing with that, dealing with the loss of your home country if you're from the East as well. That are topics, I think, that you find especially in German literature, and maybe not as much in for instance, US literature, where you will find political topics, but maybe race is a much bigger issue there than it is in Germany or even in Holland. So you have, I think, what is interesting about when you compare these three countries is that you find certain themes or certain issues and topics that are very much connected and related to that country. And that makes, by the way, reading literature from other countries so interesting. Jennifer, it was a great question, and I rambled through my answer, but I hope that some of it at least is of interest to you. Next question. Jacqueline Smith asked, how did you balance your reading time while working as a lawyer? Well, the answer is simple: poorly, because I read not half as much as I do now, now that I'm not a lawyer anymore, when I was still practicing. Partly because I was just too tired. My eyes simply were too tired because I read a lot at work. I had to read files, I had to read jurisprudence, I had to read law books. And then when you come home, or at least when I came home, I often didn't feel like reading again. I discovered audiobooks back then when I was a lawyer because I could still listen even when my eyes were too tired to read. So I would, when I was still practicing, and I would read mainly the weekend and on holiday. Those would be the times that I read really a lot. And the daily reading time was mostly half an hour before I went to sleep. I would read in bed. That's how I tried to, read at least a fair amount, but not halfway as much as I can read now. The next question is from Gemma, and she asks, could you share a couple of your favorite reads from this year? And then she means obviously 2017, because I posted the video in December last year. And which authors writing in German, in your opinion, deserve more attention from readers? Well, I had a really good reading year in 2017. I read a lot of books, and there were a lot of great books. And I don't want to dwell on that forever and ever. So I picked just two, a fiction and a non-fiction book. And the non-fiction book I really loved was Corey Stamper, Word by Word. Corey Stamper makes dictionaries, and she wrote a memoir about what it means to make dictionaries. And I thought that book was funny and insightful and interesting and well written, and I really loved it. And the fiction book was even harder to pick because there were really a lot of good fiction books I read last year. And I picked one because I feel that this book didn't get the attention it deserved, even though it was nominated for the Man Booker, and that is Home Fire. The author Camilla Shamsi wrote a retelling of the Antigone myth, but in modern day America. And it deals with terrorism, it deals with immigration, it deals with identity. And thought it was, I really loved the book. I thought it was an interesting way of retelling this myth. I love the Antigone story, and the language was quite special. Not for everybody, I think, and the book probably isn't for everybody anyway because it's a specific tale. But I loved it, so it was one of my favorite reads of last year. And the second part of Gemma's question about German authors, that was a similar question asked by Abdi, who was wondering if there were great German novels that I read and loved and would recommend. Um, well, I will leave links to two videos I made about German gems, so books in written in German but translated, so available in English, that I would recommend. So I'll leave those links down below. I don't have to talk about that long. And in general, the German authors that I feel are underrated are almost always authors that are not translated. And one that comes to mind, one of my favorite German authors, is Annette Paint. Phent is her last name, and I love her work. She has written, I think, 5 or 6 novels so far, but none of them have been translated. So if you read German, you should definitely check out Annette Paint, and if you are interested in translated German fiction, you might want to check out the videos that I link below. Next question from Gore Vidal. I'm curious about the reading habits among people you know, friends and acquaintances and their children. Are they reading books for pleasure? Partly. My mother, who's still alive, reads a lot, fiction and non-fiction. So I grew up in a household with a lot of reading, and many of my friends read. One of my best friends as well here in Cologne, as best friends in Amsterdam, they all read. I have a book club here in Cologne where we meet once every 2 or 3 months and read a book, but not all of them. I have friends who don't read a lot, and we talk about other things than books. But I would say 90% of the friends and acquaintances I have do love reading, and that's also something that binds us. On to the next question. Oh dear, I'll probably totally butcher that name. I'm so sorry. Aln Subuga, I think. Aln Subuga. Which books made you have the strongest reactions? Laughter, sadness, anger, fear, etc. That's a very good question, and one that I can't really answer. I think the strongest reaction I always get if a book surprises me, and one of the fiction books that comes to mind from a recent read is the books by Lionel Shriver. I think her work is always quite controversial and surprising, and one of the books I read, So Much for That, is a novel by her dealing with medical issues, with the way the medical system works in the US. And that book made me laugh, but also made me angry. And it's always this kind of surprise that I'm looking for to get the strongest reactions. Dutch Girl Reading asks, when you are in Amsterdam, which bookshops do you go to? How much time do you spend reading? What is your best reading moment of the day? Do you make notes when reading? And the thing I'm most curious about, what are your 10 all-time favorite books? Well, the first part, Amsterdam. I love Atheneum, which is a very good bookstore in the center of Amsterdam, but I also love the Book Exchange, which is a used bookstore selling English books, and those two are definitely my favorite books. As for reading time, I said earlier already that I now read a lot because I'm an author, so reading is part of my work, so to speak. Mostly I read starting in the afternoon and then into the evening, and I would say I read on average, I don't know, 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours a day. And the best reading moments are always, late afternoon, early evening when all the work is done and I'm still fit in my mind, not too tired to pick up a new book and then read. And what was the last question? Do you make notes? Yes, I do. I either make notes in the margins of the books or often, especially with nonfiction, which I often read on my e-reader, I write notes. You can write notes in the book. But I also take notes sometimes just on a notepad if I read. So all kinds of different ways of taking notes. And my 10 all-time favorite books, I'm sorry, Dutch Girl Reading, that's a question I'm just completely unable to answer. I can maybe come up with, because my reading taste always changes, and I know that when I was young I loved the books of the French writer François Sagan. Those were my favorite books, but I don't want to reread them now because they belong to a certain time, and I don't think that I would love them as much if I read them now. But if I look, just a couple of years, then I would say the one of the books that came to mind that really stuck with me is Renee Denfeld, Enchanted, about a man on death row. I thought this book was spectacular and different and really, really, yeah, stuck with me. And I wrote down a couple of others. That was Amy Waldman's Submission, about the 9/11 memorial, and she wrote a novel about what would happen if a Muslim architect would win the submission to build the memorial. Mary Doria Russell, The Sparrow, which is it's a science fiction and one of my absolute all-time favorite science fiction books. It's very dark and quite gruesome, but it's fantastic. All the books by Janet Winterson, they are loved. Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit was the first book I read by her, I think 20 years ago, and I still love that book. And Patricia Dunker, Hallucinating Foucault. So those are just a couple from more recent years, that books that I really loved. Ann-Katrina Gamse asked whether I go to book fairs at all or whether I don't. Well, I go to book fairs as an author to give readings. That's part of what you have to do. But as a reader, I don't. Well, sometimes I do. One or twice I went to a book fair, but I don't do well in really, really big crowds. So most of the time I don't go to book fairs. I'm sorry. GB Subscribes asked, what was the book that first sparked your interest in science fiction? And also, how did you acquire the lovely pearl earrings you're wearing? Well, these earrings were a present from my parents a long time ago. And the love of science fiction actually was sparked by movies more than by a certain book. I saw the Blade Runner and Odyssey 2001 when I was very young, and I loved those movies. And those two movies, I think, really sparked my interest in reading also science fiction. I read 2001 Space Odyssey as a book then after I saw the movie, and from there I went on reading science fiction and I never stopped. And the last question from the lovely Russell over at Ink and Paper Blog, also a fantastic channel you should subscribe to if you are not. What is the book that you have bought for the most people and why? Mostly I buy books specifically for somebody. So it's not one book that I give to everybody. I always try to find out what kind of books they like to read and what maybe they haven't read yet, and then I buy. But if I can't come up with anything like that, then my go-to book, and I think that's what Russell meant, is Sylvia Plath, Bell Jar. Because it's a classic, because it's about a well-written, dark book about a woman experiencing a mental breakdown. So I'm careful whom to give that book to, I have to say, because I need to know whether somebody could handle this kind of story and would enjoy it. But that is certainly one of my go-to books if I don't have a specific book for a specific person. But I always think it's much better to try and find out what that person would love to read and then buy that book, even if it's a book that I might not read. So this video is horribly long already. I think it's over 20 minutes. But those were all the reading questions, and I will make another video about writing and other stuff questions, I hope this weekend. Well, this was it then. I hope you enjoyed my answers. Leave comments as always. I love to hear your comments. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all soon in part 2 of my answers. Bye-bye.